The atmosphere which accompanied the genesis of Metroid Fusion was eerily similar in some ways to how the Metroid franchise feels right now. The future of the series was uncertain, completely up in the air. The people responsible for it were plagued by anxiety, and one of the closest similarities between these two eras is the fact that Nintendo began them being really pissed off at Retro Studios. At least I assume Nintendo is mad at Retro right now, since they failed to make a bestseller out of a game they had 6 years to work on, and given even a conservative estimate of Metroid Prime 4's budget, it hasn't broken even yet and probably never will. Who can say though? I mean, maybe Nintendo has gotten more understanding about these things since a financial expert became their CEO. It's possible. But a quarter of a century ago, Nintendo was upset at Retro for a different reason. They hadn't put out any games at all, despite Nintendo having invested a hefty chunk of change in building a state-of-the-art office for them in Austin, Texas a couple of years before. And this was very disconcerting to Nintendo's top brass, because they already had evidence of this kind of situation leading to disastrous results in the past. One of the few N64 console exclusives to see major success with older gamers, the 13 to 19 demographic that was historically so difficult for Nintendo to hook, was a first-person shooter called Turok Dinosaur Hunter, which came out in the spring of 1997 and almost immediately sold like crazy. Turok made a pile of money for Nintendo, as well as its publisher, Acclaim, and developer, an idiosyncratic studio owned by Acclaim called Iguana Entertainment. The trouble was, when this studio wasn't making gems like Turok or Iggy's Wreckin' Balls, this is a good game, I swear, no matter what Nintendo Power says. It was making generic tie-in games and sports titles that often reviewed poorly and never came close to challenging market leaders like FIFA or Madden. Despite large budgets and a lot of experienced talent, Iguana Entertainment never became the hit factory that Acclaim expected. And after a while, they put this failure down to the management of Iguana's original founder and president, industry veteran Jeff Spangenberg. Spangenberg was exactly the kind of guy you'd expect to be running a small American software company in the late 90s, a tech geek who learned to code instead of going to college, and had a weakness for living it up in a frankly pretty sleazy way. Having built up a successful studio from practically nothing, he seemed to feel that attending every planning meeting and being in the office every day was no longer a reasonable expectation. He basically checked out, like what happened with George Broussard of 3D Realms after the success of Duke Nukem made him a superstar, although for Spangenberg the slide from grace was much more sudden. In July of 1998, Acclaim finally fired Spangenberg and froze him out of his ownership stake in Iguana. Spangenberg shot back by suing them for breach of contract, but the suit never went to court and a settlement was never disclosed. The chances are high that he was paid a settlement to drop the suit, but it didn't get him his old job back, so Spangenberg and Iguana went their separate ways. Not that it did Acclaim much good. Their troubles ran much deeper than one absentee executive, and by the end of 2004 they were bankrupt and out of the market. The point is, back in 1998, this split was bad for everybody. Acclaim lost the services of a great talent, Spangenberg lost a cushy job, and gamers everywhere lost the glorious prospect of Iggy's Wreckin' Balls 2 wreck harder. And this was something that Nintendo should have been concerned about. They were involved in this whole affair, not just because many Iguana-developed games came out for their console, but also because the company that Jeff Spangenberg founded after leaving Acclaim under a cloud was Retro Studios. Retro was able to form a partnership with Nintendo because the team at Nintendo of America, especially its chairman, Howard Lincoln, appreciated Jeff Spangenberg's experience and track record of successful games. But back at the company's main office in Japan, this deal was viewed with suspicion. Nintendo could publish games like Turok, sure, but they had never made one before, and they weren't sure that it was suitable for the brand image of a company most strongly associated in the public's mind with a roly-poly Italian plumber and an impish Robin Hood look-alike with pointy ears. Spangenberg's edgy sensibilities and obsession with scantily clad women would have scared them to death, so you won't be surprised to hear that Nintendo looked on all of Retro's projects with a jaundiced eye. Shigeru Miyamoto, who often liaised with external partners on Nintendo's behalf, visited Retro Studios several times every year, and he was rarely impressed by what he saw. A Retro employee described his visits as being like Emperor Palpatine reviewing the construction of the Death Star. Miyamoto may have been disturbed by how unsuited many of Retro's projects seemed to the classic Nintendo brand. Among the games it was developing were a vehicular combat sim, a Western-style RPG, and a football game, all of which would have been a tough sell to Nintendo fans, and none of which would work as launch titles for the upcoming GameCube. There was only one idea which might have worked, an action-adventure game imaginatively titled Action Adventure. But thanks to Spangenberg's involvement, this game's premise wasn't all that family-friendly. It was basically Charlie's Angels in space, 3 hot chicks in skin-tight spacesuits, waving laser pistols around and doing karate. This could have shaped up into a unique and fun experience, probably a lot better than the actual Charlie's Angels game published by Ubisoft a few years later. But Miyamoto was more interested in the possibilities of applying Retro's impressive technology to an entirely different project, bringing the long-defunct Metroid series into the third dimension. In the 6 years since the release of Super Metroid, Samus had been gone, but not forgotten, especially by Nintendo's American fans. Metroid had always been more popular in the States than in its own home country, and Miyamoto was constantly fielding questions about when they were going to make the next Metroid game. The previous year's Super Smash Bros., which featured Samus as one of its core fighters, had only whetted the public's appetite for more alien-exploding action, but Nintendo had nothing to offer it. The trouble was that Super Metroid's team had been scattered to the four winds since its disappointing commercial performance in 1994, and there was no one left at Nintendo to fight for the series' continued existence. Gunpei Yokoi was gone, Makoto Kano was essentially retired, Hiroji Kiyotake was busy making Wario Land games, and Toru Osawa had joined the Zelda team. The only one who was still Mr. Metroid at Nintendo was Yoshio Sakamoto, but he wasn't in a position to insist on anything after his involvement with the failed Virtual Boy. On top of that, he just didn't have any new ideas for Metroid, and maintaining the series' appeal in 3D seemed impossible, so he kept quiet and worked on other things. It was obvious to Miyamoto that any new Metroid game would necessarily be made by a brand new team, so he figured, why not a really new team? Like, not actually Nintendo employees new. Fresh talent would bring a fresh perspective to this troubled series, and maybe solve the problems that the developers of Super Metroid couldn't. So he laid down some new guidelines for Retro. Stop making this action-adventure game, start making a 3D Metroid game, and, oh, by the way, put it in first person, because that third-person perspective isn't working. Retro set to work, and within a few weeks they had a 10-second teaser for Nintendo to show off at their annual Space World trade show, along with the hotly anticipated GameCube. All that happens in this teaser is that a door opens, Samus runs through it being pursued by a swarm of insects, and at the end she aims her arm cannon at the camera and fires a missile. And yet this was one of the most popular parts of the show. It got a huge round of applause. And this made Nintendo realize something. The crowd wasn't clapping because of how good the trailer looked. It was clapping because people really wanted more Metroid. This new console generation was an opportunity to hype the series up the way it had never been hyped before, and possibly turn a niche franchise into a major Nintendo brand like Mario or Zelda. And the result of all this effort was one of the best-loved games in console history, Metroid Prime. I've heard it suggested that Nintendo developed Metroid Fusion as a way of hedging their bets, so that if Prime flopped, there would be an alternative to remind everyone that Metroid was still a good series. This idea may have influenced their decision-making somewhat, but I don't really believe that story for two reasons. First of all, if Prime failed, Nintendo would be in big trouble whether or not they had another Metroid game to put in its place. And second, they had no guarantee as to when either of these two projects was going to be finished, so attempting to use Fusion as a crutch for Prime would actually have been quite risky. It might not have been released quickly enough to do them any good. I choose to take a more positive interpretation of these events. Nintendo didn't develop Fusion because they were worried about Prime. They did it because Prime generated so much excitement about the series. Before that Space World trailer, having worked on Metroid was at best a neutral entry on a Nintendo employee's resume. After the trailer, it was a point of pride. Before Retro began working on Prime, Yoshio Sakamoto had no ideas for Metroid stories and wasn't trying to develop any. Once they got to work, he had competition for that previously uncontested crown, and he did start coming up with new story ideas. I'm not going to say that all these new feelings were constructive or healthy. Competitiveness can be a very destructive impulse. But they did all lead to more work being done on Metroid, and that's a good thing. Up to this point, I've dwelled on the development of Metroid Prime because, honestly, not much is known about the development of Fusion, except that it started several months after Prime was announced, and it's reasonable to infer that it was jump-started by the public reaction to Prime. And one other thing we know. In contrast to most Metroid games, it didn't take long to develop. The game went from a very rough and choppy demo at E3 in 2001 to looking and sounding almost exactly like the finished product at the next E3 in 2002. Despite its having started development after Metroid Prime, we can assume that Fusion was probably complete several months before Prime was, but Nintendo decided to release them at the same time in order to promote both games more effectively. Coming as they did from a tech-oriented division like R&D1, Metroid games up to this point tended to get bogged down in pre-production, but to develop rapidly once their basic premises and mechanics were worked out. The original game notoriously spent almost a year with just 2 employees working out the basics before the rest of the team got involved, and finished it in 3 months. Metroid Prime's development was no exception, with a sluggish and difficult start capped off by 9 months of hyperactivity and endless crunch time. But Fusion was different. It's a member of that rare and much-envied group of Nintendo classics that took less than 2 years from start to finish. Games which seemed from the customer's point of view to flow smoothly from the brains of their creators right onto the TV screen. Obviously, it wasn't that easy, but I get the feeling that making Metroid Fusion didn't permanently mess up anyone's sleep cycle or give them post-crunch psychosis the way Prime did. It managed to avoid a lot of potential hiccups, partly because it had a lot of its pre-production, the hardest part of any Metroid project, done for it in advance. Which, together with its being made by the same team as Wario Land 4, may explain how it ended up so strange. From the outset, Metroid Fusion presents itself as a very different experience from what Metroid fans were used to. For one thing, this was the first game in the series whose placement in the timeline is ambiguous compared to the other games. Metroid 2 begins almost immediately after the end of the original game, and Super Metroid has to take place a month or so after Metroid 2 for its plot to make any sense. But there's no indication of how much time elapses between the end of Super Metroid and the beginning of Fusion. It could be a few months later, or several years, possibly a lot of years. Samus is still working as a bounty hunter for the Galactic Federation, which has a bigger role in Fusion's plot than in previous games. But when the game opens, it seems like she's accepted a private commission as a bodyguard and guide for a bioresearch company called Biologic Space Laboratories. She's leading a research team over the surface of planet SR-388, the setting of Metroid 2 and original home of the Metroids, looking for undiscovered animal specimens. As she blasts away at a Hornode, its body suddenly dissolves, leaving behind a floating amoeba-like creature which latches onto her suit and appears to somehow seep through it. Because Samus shows no ill effects from this attack, the team decides to continue the mission, which goes off without a hitch. But as Samus is accompanying the rescue team back to BSL's research station, she suddenly and instantly loses consciousness, causing her ship to drift into an asteroid belt. Emergency systems kick in to seal her into an escape pod and propel it to safety, but the ship itself is pulverized. Back at Galactic Federation headquarters, medical researchers are astonished to find that Samus was infected by an unknown parasitic organism, which has managed to proliferate through her entire body and seize control of her central nervous system within hours of being ingested. Because Samus's power suit is biomechanical, it too is infected. And worse, with her unconscious, the suit is impossible to remove normally. As they attempt to isolate and destroy the infection, GF doctors are forced to surgically cut out and remove huge chunks of the suit, rendering Samus's physical appearance mutilated and unrecognizable. Even this, however, is not enough to save her. The parasite, which the Federation codenames X, proves to be unbelievably tenacious and adaptable. Every move the medical team takes to combat the X-parasite is rapidly countered by a new and unpredictable mutation. For a moment, it seems that the galaxy's greatest warrior, who couldn't be stopped by vicious pirates or monstrous aliens, is going to be slain by a mere disease. But then the team has a breakthrough. Reasoning that the emergence of X-parasites may have something to do with the recent extinction of Metroids, a researcher proposes creating a vaccine out of a cell culture taken from the last infant Metroid. By injecting Samus with the vaccine, they cause Samus's DNA to partially fuse with the Metroids, and as the team hoped, every last X-parasite is suppressed and ultimately absorbed by Samus's newly Metroidified cells. Samus finally regains consciousness, only to find herself radically transformed, both inside and out. Since the beginning of the series, Samus was always something more than human because of her life among the Chozo, but those were at least sentient beings. Now she also possesses the same genetic code as the aggressive, uncontrollable aliens which she'd dedicated her life to destroying. Samus also suddenly realizes that the infant Metroid, whose life she spared, has now saved her life twice, and this time from beyond the grave. She has no time to dwell on this realization, however, as the Federation soon receives a distress call from the BSL research station, where Samus's suit parts and the potentially infected specimens from SR-388 were sent before the true nature of the X-parasites had been determined. As the Federation's most trusted operative, and the only person in the galaxy with an immunity to X-parasites, Samus is called upon to investigate the disturbance. She's issued a new ship, with an AI commander to relay instructions from the GF, and sent off to handle a threat the scale of which she can only imagine. Samus's initial goal in Fusion is simple reconnaissance, figure out what's going on at the station. The first 10 minutes or so are relatively peaceful and enemy-free, like the opening of Super Metroid, which forces the game to lean pretty heavily on the mysteries inherent in its premise to draw you in. This detective novel aspect of the plot persists as things take a more dramatic turn, but it ultimately takes a back seat to the escalating danger posed by the X-parasites. Samus eventually discovers that not only were all the specimens from SR-388 infected by parasites, but they've also broken out of the quarantine room where they were being held. Her infected suit parts are missing too, and computer scans indicate that the X are gathering in a distant corner of the station's main deck. The AI commander tells Samus to engage with this group of X, but also to stop along the way to receive a transmission from the Federation which will restore her ability to use missiles. As in all Metroid games, Samus begins Fusion with a basic arsenal of combat and platforming abilities, which is expanded as the game progresses. But what makes both Fusion and its companion game Prime different is that they acknowledge the inconsistency of Samus losing all her powers between games and justify it through plot developments. Prime's idea is to have Samus get caught in an explosion that knocks out most of her suit's capabilities, which honestly isn't much better than not addressing the issue at all. Samus gets blown up all the time, it's part of her job description, so the idea that this explosion barely injures her but makes her suit stop working is hard to swallow. Echoes had a more interesting version of this premise, with the Ing pouncing on Samus and literally stealing her powers at the beginning of the game, before she's capable of coping with the environment of Dark Ether. And then, in Corruption, they just went back to not explaining it, which works fine as far as I'm concerned. But Fusion has what I would argue is the best explanation of Samus's powerlessness: the X infection which almost killed her. Many people in real life are left much weaker after a serious illness, and that can also include changes in their physical appearance. In Samus's case, it wasn't the infection itself that took her powers away, but her losing them because of the X is dramatically satisfying. It seems like what should happen after such an ordeal, and it ties into an important theme in Fusion: the fear of being taken over or replaced. The Metroid series as a whole has had a few things to say about the idea of extinction, what it means, how it happens, why it happens, but it never really drove home the idea of human extinction, because the space pirates were never characterized as that kind of threat. They wanted to rule the galaxy, not wipe out all humans, and their ability to destroy galactic civilization, even with Metroids on their side, was always questionable. For all their barbarity and viciousness, the pirates have been consistently portrayed as practical. If they could get more for themselves by keeping humans alive to serve them, they would. But Fusion's villains, the X-parasites, act more like a virus, mindlessly and perpetually consuming other living creatures to reproduce more of themselves, only taking on the appearance and mannerisms of their prey to blend in and facilitate further consumption. There's no logical endpoint to this process. With no natural predators to keep their numbers under control, the role which Metroids are presumed to have occupied before they went extinct, X-parasites will literally eat everything, leading to a universe apparently teeming with biodiversity, but actually consisting of a single species. At the same time, Fusion subtly goads the player with a disturbing question: what does it really mean to be a unique species? If the X-parasites can make a perfect copy of what you used to be, indistinguishable from the original down to the last fingernail and freckle, even imitating your behavior, how different is that really from you? What if it did the same thing to something not commonly perceived as sentient, like a housefly? Would that copy not count as an actual fly, just because its DNA is different, even if it never changed back? How much of your mind would it have to copy before we acknowledged the parasite as sentient, thus deserving the same moral consideration as a human being? Metroid Fusion is set in an enormous research station, filled with dozens upon dozens of extraordinary alien species, and by the time Samus runs across them, they are all X-parasites in disguise. The only independent enemy is a rogue security robot, which she fights about halfway through the game, and even it is ultimately infected and replicated later on. Out of all these exceptional creatures, none is agile or strong enough to fight off the X. Ceres, a lightning-fast water serpent which the AI detects causing havoc in the aquatic habitat at one point, is eventually found by Samus in its resting tank, as a skeleton, its bones picked clean, with the X that copied it lurking in the next room over. The Nightmare, a human-developed bioweapon with the power to warp gravity itself, is still no match for these floating amoebas. You see it at one point in the Sub-Zero habitat flying back and forth and roaring, and at first you might think this is just foreshadowing for the eventual boss fight, but it's worse than that. A moment's reflection will tell you that this hyperactivity is actually the Nightmare trying to run away from the parasites, its last desperate attempt to fend off the inevitable. The only effective defense against infection by the X is the Metroid DNA that Samus has, but that won't do much good when they can use the strengths of every other creature against her as well. Her only hope is to restore the abilities she's lost by finding Core X who have retained her powers and receiving supplemental downloads from the Federation. And that last part raises another concern. How was the Federation able to replicate Samus's powers in the first place? Her power suit is supposed to be completely unique and only work for her. The Prime trilogy repeatedly emphasizes how difficult it was for the space pirates to even imperfectly simulate her abilities. While the first few downloads can be explained as being based on existing tech, after all, this isn't the first time Samus has used a GF-issue missile launcher, later she discovers that they've also figured out her Varia suit and plasma beam, which only the Chozo should know about. Clearly, the Federation has been doing a lot of checking up on Samus without her knowing. It makes you think that maybe the X aren't the only ones trying to replace Samus, or the only thing she should be worried about. Of course, the Federation could never hope to copy Samus's powers as quickly and thoroughly as Fusion's primary antagonist already has. One of the first things you discover in this game is that one of the X-parasites is walking around as an imitation of a fully powered-up Samus. This particular specimen, codenamed the SAX, almost certainly emerged from the infected suit parts sent to the BSL station, and is likely responsible for destroying the quarantine bay and releasing all the other X from containment. That would be no problem for someone with power bombs at their disposal. The SAX is the most famous aspect of Metroid Fusion, and for good reason. It's friggin' chilling. At several points in the story, it's shown to be actively tracking Samus, and you have to run away from it every time. As a quasi-Metroid, Samus now shares their one fatal weakness. She's vulnerable to being frozen and blown up with missiles. The SAX appears to instinctively view Samus as a Metroid and knows to use the Ice Beam against her, so any fight you pick with it is bound to be short and unpleasant. It's darkly ironic that, on a superficial level, the SAX is now more like the classic image of Samus Aran than Samus herself is. When it attacks you, what happens feels like a parody of Samus effortlessly blowing up a Metroid in the other games. In the Prime trilogy, Retro Studios was careful to distinguish Dark Samus from the original model in several obvious ways, but in Fusion, stress is laid on how much Samus's evil twin resembles her. The only visible difference is its empty, soulless eyes staring out from beneath Samus's visor. But what's really disturbing about the SAX is that it's smart. While the rest of the X are just hovering around looking for more creatures to consume, the SAX cuts away at the station's infrastructure to restrict Samus's movements, making it easier to set up the final kill shot. The moment she ventures down into the breeding habitats, it knocks out the main elevator, cutting her off from her ship and any potential human survivors on the habitation deck. When it realizes that Samus is using data rooms to power herself up, it follows her and systematically destroys them one by one. Later on, ordinary X start displaying a capacity for strategic thinking as well, but the SAX remains Samus's most relentlessly intimidating enemy throughout the story. The Emmy robots from Metroid Dread were a clear attempt to follow up on this idea, one of many ways in which Dread rehashes the plot of Fusion, but the strict partition between that game's stealth and action segments lets the player off the hook emotionally and prevents any proper suspense from building up. Also, the decision to give Samus weapons capable of destroying the Emmy long before the endgame may have been an interesting one from a gameplay perspective, but it wrecks the feeling, which the game does try to cultivate through its atmosphere and dialogue, that these are creatures Samus is too weak to fight. The Omega Cannon is an obvious plot device that makes them only situationally invincible, not because Samus truly lacks the strength to fight them, but because they have magic plot armor that's only weak to plot-coated bullets. The SAX was invincible not because it was impossible to damage, but because its offense was so strong against Samus specifically that she couldn't survive a fight with it. The premise of Fusion sets up this clever dichotomy by which Samus is simultaneously the only person capable of fighting the X-parasites, and the worst possible person to fight this particular X-parasite. Missions are framed in such a way that you constantly worry about running into the SAX, even though it only shows up about half a dozen times over 5 or 6 hours of gameplay. When people say that Metroid Fusion has too much dialogue, and that its excessively linear progression ruins the atmosphere that the series was known for, I think a big part of what they're objecting to is a loss of subtlety. Environmental design is subtle, and can tell a surprisingly complex story purely by implication. But written dialogue is blatant. It spells out for you what's going on and how characters feel about it. Progress being gated off by mobility upgrades is subtle, concealing alternate paths from the player until the most accessible path has been explored and backtracking reveals an unexpected use for new power-ups. Progress being gated off by locked doors is unsubtle. It just puts an invisible wall in front of the player and says, "You can't go here yet." So it would be fair to say that compared with Super Metroid, Metroid Fusion is not a subtle or understated gaming experience. It's about as melodramatic as a game can be, with a silent antagonist, one protagonist, and a single friendly NPC, who isn't all that friendly anyway. But in this one case, its use of suspense and the looming threat hanging over Samus at all times, Fusion is subtle. Definitely subtler than Dread and Other M when they attempted to do the same thing. Fusion's biggest weakness as a Metroid game is also the reason I love it so much. The fact that it actually tried to tell a story, and to tell one the whole time, not just at the beginning and the end like Super Metroid. It's the first, and I would argue also the last, truly great story that Yoshio Sakamoto wrote. And even the things that people mock about it, like Samus's elevator speeches, are inseparable from its appeal. So I'm about to do something very unusual for me. I'm going to leave this video about the legacy of Metroid Fusion unfinished, at least for now. And here's why. I said in my video on Super Metroid that if you really want to understand Metroid as a series, that's the one game you absolutely have to play, whether or not you play any of the others. I feel even more strongly that to understand the last 2 decades of Metroid, you have to know the story of Metroid Fusion. For better or for worse, this is the game that introduced traditional storytelling to the series, and every subsequent game has in some way responded to that. But for me to cover Fusion's story in depth, you have to know about it, and I frankly don't want to spoil this story any more than I have up to now. I want to at least give you a chance to learn about it on your own and come to your own conclusions, either by playing it or watching a playthrough of it. The game is available on the Nintendo Switch Online service, which means it's more accessible these days than it was for more than a decade prior to 2023 when it was included. However, and I say this with the best will in the world, for easily more than half of this video's viewers, you will get just as much out of Fusion by watching someone else play it as you would playing it yourself. I won't say you're not missing much, because I love playing this game, but it's become quite clear over the years that most Metroid fans don't, let alone the broader gaming public generally. So I'll be back in a little while to discuss the rest of Metroid Fusion, when you've had some time to experience the story for yourself, or decide you don't give a toss about spoilers. Either way, in the next video, I'll assume you know what I'm talking about, so there's going to be substantially more analysis, and not so much summarizing as previously, which should have the beneficial effect of keeping the script more concise. Until then, thanks for tuning in everybody, and have a nice vacation.